The shadow, as I have often said, is not merely the dark side of the individual, it is also the unacknowledged darkness of the collective. In every age, humanity projects its inner conflicts outward, clothing its repressed impulses in myth, religion, and today in popular culture. When society loses touch with its soul, the unconscious compensates by producing images and stories that reveal what has been denied. The Joker is one such image, a living embodiment of the collective shadow, a mirror held up to modern civilization's inner emptiness. His madness is not an isolated pathology, but a reflection of the insanity that arises when meaning is lost, and the soul has been abandoned in favor of masks and systems. In the Joker, society encounters the truth it refuses to face, that beneath the surface of order and civility lies a deep reservoir of rage, humiliation, and despair. He is the outcast who exposes the hypocrisy of those who call themselves sane. The laughter of the Joker is not joy, it is the scream of the unconscious erupting through the cracks of repression. When a civilization forgets the sacred, when it reduces human worth to productivity, appearance, and obedience, the neglected soul rebels. The Joker becomes its prophet, chaotic, anarchic, and terrifyingly honest. He does not create disorder, he reveals a disorder that already exists within us. In Jungian psychology, projection is the mechanism by which the psyche disowns parts of itself, seeing them instead in others. Collectively, we project our violence, greed, and despair onto figures we label monsters or villains, believing that by condemning them, we purify ourselves. Yet the very intensity with which society fixates on such figures betrays the presence of what it denies. The Joker captivates us not because he is alien, but because he represents the forbidden part of ourselves. He acts without shame, he speaks without restraint, and exposes the absurdity of our moral pretenses. He is what the modern ego secretly envies, the freedom to be authentic, even in destruction. The fascination with the Joker across generations reveals a deep psychological hunger. Audiences do not merely watch him, they resonate with him. In his descent into madness, they recognize their own suppressed pain. The loneliness, the humiliation, the yearning for significance. All of these are common human experiences, yet they are seldom given voice in a culture obsessed with control and perfection. The Joker, stripped of illusion, embodies the chaos that lives beneath the mask of normality. His violence is symbolic, a dark ritual of liberation from the suffocating constraints of conformity. He destroys not for pleasure, but to reveal the hollowness of what we have built. What we see in the Joker is the result of a world that denies its shadow. When empathy is lost and systems replace human connection, the soul revolts. The rise of nihilism, cynicism, and moral confusion in art is not the cause of our sickness, it is the symptom. The collective unconscious, the unable to express itself through meaning and myth, turns to extreme images to demand attention. Through the Joker, it cries out for acknowledgement, I exist. You cannot build a world of light while refusing to see your own darkness. His madness is the mirror of our denial, his chaos the counterbalance to our false order. To understand the Joker psychologically is to see him not as a villain to be destroyed, but as a messenger from the depths of the psyche. He reminds us that the shadow cannot be eradicated, it can only be integrated. The same energy that manifests as destruction, if made conscious, can become creativity, compassion, and wisdom. But as long as we refuse to face it, that energy will emerge in distorted forms, in crime, in corruption, in the growing alienation that pervades modern life. Every act of repression strengthens the shadow's power, and every denial of responsibility brings it closer to eruption. In the end, the Joker's story is our own. He shows us what happens when the soul is forgotten, when the inner world is sacrificed to the demands of the external. He laughs because he has seen through the illusion of control, and though his laughter is madness, it contains a strange kind of truth. He exposes the collective lie that society is healthy, that reason alone can sustain meaning, that progress can replace purpose. Through his chaos, he speaks the ancient language of the unconscious, the demand for wholeness. And though we fear him, we are drawn to him, because somewhere within, we know that his darkness is the reflection of our own. When a man suppresses the truth of his own nature, that truth does not disappear, it retreats into the unconscious, gathering force until it emerges with destructive power. This is the law of the psyche. What we repress, we become possessed by. Walter White, the quiet chemistry teacher who becomes the ruthless Heisenberg, is a perfect illustration of this eternal psychological principle. His story in Breaking Bad is not merely a tale of moral decay. It is an allegory of the shadow's revenge. It reveals what happens when a man denies his instincts, his ambition, his anger, and his need for self-expression, until those very forces consume him from within. At the beginning of his journey, the Walter White appears to be an archetype of conformity. He is intelligent but unfulfilled, capable yet invisible. He lives a life of quiet desperation, trapped by fear, duty, and social expectation. The persona he presents to the world, the humble father, the obedient employee, the moral citizen, is a mask. Beneath it lies a boiling reservoir of resentment, envy, and desire. He feels emasculated by a society that measures worth by success and dominance. Yet he convinces himself that he is virtuous because he suppresses these feelings. Jung would say he lives entirely in his persona, blind to his shadow, and therefore at the mercy of it. The moment Walter begins to act outside his conventional identity, the shadow emerges. At first, he rationalizes his criminal acts as acts of love, to provide for his family. But as he continues, a strange liberation takes place. He begins to feel alive, powerful, significant. The man who once bowed before life now commands it. What he tells himself is necessity is, in truth, desire. The shadow that had been chained in the depths of his soul rises to the surface and takes control of his will. The transformation into Heisenberg is the process of possession, the ego overwhelmed by the very instincts it denied. The Heisenberg persona is not the invention of evil, but the eruption of unintegrated energy. It is Walter's repressed vitality, the now unrestrained and unbalanced. Every act of deceit and violence becomes a ritual of empowerment, an assertion of the self that had been humiliated and silenced for too long. The tragedy lies in the absence of consciousness. Had Walter faced his shadow earlier, acknowledged his ambition, his anger, his need for significance, he could have integrated these aspects and transformed them into creative power. Instead, his refusal to see himself clearly turns those same energies destructive. The chemist who once created molecules now creates chaos. His life becomes the laboratory of the unconscious, and he its experiment. From a Jungian perspective, repression is never a moral virtue. It is a psychological danger. The shadow is not inherently evil. It is simply everything the ego refuses to accept. It includes instincts, passions, and potentials that are necessary for wholeness. When these are denied, the personality becomes one-sided, rigid, and fragile. The energy of the unconscious, deprived of conscious expression, seeks to balance the psyche through compulsive or destructive behavior. Walter's descent is therefore not an anomaly. It is a predictable outcome of repression. The more he clings to his moral self-image, the deeper he falls under the shadow's spell. There is a moment in Breaking Bad when Walter declares, "I am the one who knocks." This is not merely arrogance, it is revelation. It is the moment when the repressed part of his psyche finally speaks through him, claiming its power. The statement is terrifying precisely because it is true. He has become the thing he denied. The fear that once ruled him has transformed into dominance, but the transformation is incomplete. It lacks integration, reflection, compassion. He is awake, but without wisdom. This is the danger of unconscious individuation. When the journey toward wholeness begins without self-knowledge, it becomes a descent into madness rather than enlightenment. Walter's story serves as a warning for every individual who confuses repression with virtue. The shadow cannot be destroyed by denial. It must be made conscious through honest confrontation. Only then can its energy be harnessed for creativity rather than destruction. When the shadow is ignored, it acts autonomously, sabotaging relationships, careers, and inner peace. But when it is faced, it becomes a source of power, courage, and authenticity. The same energy that drives Walter to dominate could have driven him to greatness had he possessed the humility to see himself as he truly was. In every human being lies the potential for both creation and corruption. The line between them is drawn by awareness. Walter White's tragedy is not that he became evil, it is that he became unconscious. The shadow, the long denied, finally seized him, turning his intellect into a weapon and his life into a cautionary tale. What began as repression ended in possession, and what could have been transformation became destruction. His fate reminds us that no one can escape the darkness within. We either integrate it with courage or are consumed by its fire. The modern age has given rise to a peculiar form of suffering, one born not of material deprivation, but of psychic fragmentation. In earlier times, individuals derived meaning through myth, ritual, and community, which offered structure to the inner world. Today, however, the self is fractured across countless identities, filtered through screens, and measured by the reactions of others. In this condition, the shadow no longer lurks in the dark corners of the unconscious, it lives in plain sight, disguised as performance, addiction, and despair. The world of Euphoria captures this disintegration of the modern psyche, depicting young souls who are no longer at home in themselves, endlessly searching for identity in a culture that worships image over essence. The characters in Euphoria live in a world saturated with stimuli yet devoid of meaning. They experience emotions with intensity, but without direction. Their pain is not the pain of poverty or oppression, but the agony of inner emptiness. Each one constructs a persona, a digital mask, to cope with the unbearable tension between who they are and who they are expected to be. In Jungian terms, they are caught in the inflation of the persona and the neglect of the self. The persona, once a necessary social tool, has become a prison. They must project happiness, beauty, or defiance to be seen, while their true feelings, shame, loneliness, fear, are repressed. The more they perform, the more alienated they become from their inner reality. Rue, the central figure of Euphoria, embodies this alienation most profoundly. Her addiction is not simply a moral failure, but a symptom of psychic despair. She uses drugs to silence the unbearable conflict between the ego and the shadow. Her addiction is an attempt to escape the inner voices she cannot reconcile, to blur the boundaries of a self that feels too fragmented to endure. Each high becomes a temporary dissolution of the ego, a false union with the unconscious that replaces genuine integration with numbness. In Jungian language, her journey is not toward individuation, but toward unconsciousness, a regression into the darkness she cannot face sober. The other characters mirror variations of the same crisis. Some seek validation through sexuality, others through power or control. Each pursuit is a distorted expression of the longing for wholeness. They mistake intensity for intimacy, exposure for authenticity, and performance for self-realization. This confusion reflects a collective pathology, the loss of connection to the symbolic life. Without symbols, rituals, or spiritual grounding, the psyche turns its creative energy toward self-display. The shadow, deprived of sacred expression, manifests as addiction, self-harm, and anxiety. The chaos of Euphoria is not moral decay. It is the psyche's desperate attempt to make itself seen. Social media amplifies this condition. The digital world functions as a vast mirror in which individuals project and compare idealized fragments of themselves. Every image, every post becomes a negotiation between the persona and the shadow. What one hides in shame, another flaunts in defiance. The result is not authenticity but collective confusion. The boundaries between the true self and the performed self dissolve. In Jungian terms, this creates a psychic inflation, an over-identification with the persona that leaves the individual hollow. One lives in perpetual self-observation, disconnected from the inner voice that gives life coherence. This fragmentation leads to what Jung described as loss of soul. Without inner integration, individuals drift, seeking meaning in fleeting sensations or external approval. They chase stimulation because silence feels unbearable. The soul, however, speaks in silence. It cannot be reached through noise or spectacle. It demands reflection, solitude, and honesty, qualities increasingly foreign to modern life. The tragedy of Euphoria is that its characters have the courage to feel, but not the wisdom to interpret their feelings. Their emotions are raw but directionless, like signals from the unconscious that no one knows how to translate. From a Jungian perspective, the path forward is not to reject technology or modernity, but to restore the inner dialogue between the ego and the unconscious. The images that dominate digital culture must be understood symbolically rather than literally. They are expressions of the collective psyche calling for attention. The beauty, chaos, and despair we see on screen are not external phenomena, but reflections of our own disordered inner world. To heal, one must turn inward, not to escape the world, but to reconcile with the parts of the self that have been lost in it. The world of Euphoria is, in essence, the dream of a generation, a vivid, chaotic projection of a collective soul yearning for wholeness. Its darkness is not meaningless, it is revelatory. It exposes the psychic cost of living without depth, without connection to the unconscious. The pain of its characters is the pain of an entire culture that has forgotten how to dream consciously. Their suffering is a symbol, and symbols, when understood, can heal. The shadow they embody is not the end of the story. It is the invitation to begin the inner journey that our age has forgotten to take. Human beings have always feared their own darkness. We create religions, morals, and ideologies to guard ourselves against the awareness that within us live instincts, impulses, and desires that contradict our image of goodness. Yet in the language of the psyche, wholeness does not arise from perfection, but from integration. The light cannot exist without the dark, and the self cannot exist without the shadow. The modern person, obsessed with positivity and progress, often forgets that the path to wisdom is not upward, but inward, through the depths where the rejected parts of the soul dwell. To confront one's own darkness is not to become evil, it is to become real. This truth lies at the heart of Jung's psychology, and it reverberates through every story in which a character must descend into chaos to discover authenticity. The shadow is not merely the repository of what is shameful or violent, it also contains the unlived life, the potential that the ego has refused to acknowledge. Every time a person represses anger, passion, creativity, or desire in the name of social conformity, that energy retreats into the unconscious, waiting to be recognized. But because the ego fears losing control, it denies the shadow's existence, projecting it onto others as hatred or judgment. This denial fractures the personality, creating a split between the image we present and the truth we embody. Healing begins only when we turn toward the very thing we fear to see. To meet the shadow consciously is to encounter the totality of one's being, to reclaim what was exiled, and to restore balance to the psyche. The heroes and anti-heroes of modern storytelling enact this ancient psychological drama. They are mirrors of our own inner conflicts, dramatizing the necessity of dissent. The Joker, Walter White, and the tormented youth of Euphoria all represent souls who have come face to face with the shadow, but in distorted or unconscious ways. The Joker embraces chaos without compassion, Walter White integrates power without conscience. The characters of Euphoria experience emotion without understanding. Their suffering is tragic precisely because it reveals what happens when darkness is met without awareness. Yet, even in their ruin, there is a message: transformation demands confrontation. The shadow, when denied, becomes the destroyer. When accepted, it becomes the teacher. In myth, this process is symbolized by the journey into the underworld. The descent into darkness is the initiation through which the hero discovers the hidden treasure of the soul. Jung saw this as the archetype of individuation, the process by which a person becomes whole by integrating the opposites within. The underworld is not a place of punishment, but of revelation. It strips away illusions and forces the ego to encounter what it has rejected. In the same way, psychological suffering, if faced consciously, can lead to profound renewal. Depression, loss, or failure can become gateways to self-knowledge if one dares to ask what the pain is trying to reveal. The modern avoidance of darkness, through distraction, consumption, or denial, has created a spiritual emptiness. We glorify light but remain terrified of shadow, forgetting that the two are bound together. The person who identifies only with light becomes one-sided, brittle, and hypocritical. They speak of love while denying anger, of purity while repressing desire. Such a person may appear moral, but is spiritually incomplete. Jung observed that evil often arises from this very repression. When people imagine themselves wholly good, they unconsciously project their own capacity for harm onto others, creating enemies to justify their illusion of virtue. True morality arises not from denial, but from awareness, recognizing the capacity for darkness within and choosing consciously to act with integrity. To walk the path of wholeness is therefore to embrace paradox. It requires the humility to admit that what we condemn in others exists also in ourselves. It demands courage to feel the emotions we have long suppressed: fear, envy, rage, lust, and to listen to what they have to teach. Each emotion, however dark, carries a fragment of truth. Anger may conceal a longing for justice, envy may reveal an unlived potential, despair may signal the need for meaning. When these emotions are integrated, they cease to control us. The energy once bound in repression becomes available for creativity and compassion. The person who has faced their darkness is not destroyed by it. They are deepened by it. Jung once wrote that no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. This is not a glorification of evil, but an acknowledgement of psychological reality. The descent into the shadow is the price of consciousness. Those who have faced their inner darkness carry a wisdom that cannot be taught. They understand the fragility of goodness, the necessity of forgiveness, and the beauty of imperfection. Wholeness, then, is not the triumph of light over dark, but their reconciliation. The soul becomes complete not by banishing its night, but by learning to see in it. What we call darkness is not the absence of light, but its womb, and it is there, in that mysterious depth, that the true self is born. Art has always served as the voice of the unconscious. Long before psychology existed, humanity expressed its inner conflicts through myth, ritual, and storytelling. These forms were not mere entertainment, they were symbolic languages through which the psyche sought balance. Today, cinema and television have become the new mythic stage where the collective unconscious reveals itself. The modern audience gathers not around fires but screens, and what they watch are not just stories, but mirrors reflecting the hidden wounds of civilization. In this way, art functions as a form of collective therapy, offering society a way to encounter its repressed emotions and unacknowledged desires. When we examine works such as Joker, Breaking Bad, or Euphoria, we are not merely observing fiction, we are witnessing the psyche of our age in dramatized form. These stories draw their power from the archetypal energies that live in every human being. The Joker embodies the trickster, the outcast, and the agent of chaos, symbols of what happens when meaning collapses. Walter White represents the archetype of the fallen hero, the man who seeks power and freedom, but becomes enslaved by his own ambition. The young souls of Euphoria embody the archetype of the lost child, wandering through the ruins of a fragmented culture in search of identity. Each narrative is an expression of psychic imbalance and a collective yearning for wholeness. The power of such art lies in its capacity to evoke emotion and reflection. Viewers may not consciously understand Jungian theory, yet they feel its truth instinctively. When they watch the Joker laugh amid destruction, they feel both horror and fascination, for he personifies the rage they have been taught to suppress. When they see Walter White transform from a submissive man into a tyrant, they sense the buried hunger for autonomy that society discourages. When they follow Rue's spiral into addiction, they recognize their own escape into distraction, technology, or fantasy. In these experiences, the audience participates in a symbolic process of catharsis. The stories allow them to project their own shadows onto the screen, to see and feel what they cannot yet confront within themselves. This is the therapeutic function of art. It provides a safe container for the unconscious to express itself. In ancient times, this role was fulfilled by tragedy, where the audience could experience pity and terror and thus purify their emotions. In the modern era, the popular culture fulfills the same function under different forms. The violence, despair, and moral ambiguity of our most celebrated stories are not signs of cultural decay, but attempts at psychic healing. The collective shadow, denied by our obsession with progress and positivity, finds expression in art so that it does not erupt uncontrollably in life. Every generation produces the stories it needs in order to survive its own contradictions. However, the therapeutic potential of art depends on how it is received. If audiences consume these images only for stimulation, without reflection, they remain trapped in the repetition of their symptoms. The shadow becomes entertainment rather than revelation. But if one watches consciously, asking what emotion is being stirred, what truth is being symbolized, then the experience becomes transformative. The act of watching becomes an act of self-recognition. The Joker's madness, Walter's pride, Rue's despair. Each becomes a mirror through which one can glimpse the hidden dimensions of the self. Awareness transforms projection into insight, and in that moment, art fulfills its true purpose, the reconciliation of the conscious and the unconscious. From a Jungian perspective, the artist serves as a vessel for the collective unconscious. Their work channels energies that belong not to the individual alone, but to the whole culture. When the artist dares to express the forbidden, they give form to what others cannot articulate. This is why great art often feels prophetic. It reveals what society is about to experience before it becomes visible in reality. The artist, consciously or not, functions as a modern shaman, one who descends into the darkness of the psyche and returns with visions that can heal or warn. Through their creation, the collective mind begins to integrate what it has long denied. In this sense, the screen has become our modern temple, and storytelling our modern ritual. Though we may not realize it, we gather to witness psychic truths enacted before us. We laugh, we cry, we recoil, we reflect. In these emotional movements, the psyche releases tension and consciousness expands. Art invites us to participate in our own evolution. It tells us again and again that we are not alone in our contradictions, that our darkness has meaning, and that our suffering can be transformed into understanding. To say that art is collective therapy is to recognize that culture itself is a living psyche. Its creations are the dreams of humanity, and just as dreams guide the individual toward integration, art guides civilization toward balance. What appears on our screens, no matter how disturbing, is a message from the depths, a reminder that the soul still speaks, even when society forgets how to listen. The task of the viewer, like that of the patient in therapy, is not to judge the dream, but to interpret it, to ask what it reveals about who we are and what we might yet become. The greatest danger to the human soul is not its darkness, but its refusal to see it. Every individual carries within them the totality of human nature, the noble and the base, the generous and the cruel, the loving and the destructive. When one imagines oneself to be purely good, purely rational, or purely virtuous, one has already fallen into illusion. The unacknowledged darkness does not disappear, it simply acts from the shadows, influencing thoughts, emotions, and behavior in ways the conscious mind cannot understand. To own the darkness within is not to glorify it, but to recognize it as an inseparable part of life, a source of both danger and potential. Jung taught that only by integrating the shadow can we become whole, for wholeness includes all that we are, not only what we wish to be. The denial of darkness begins early in life. Children learn what is acceptable and what is forbidden, and to gain approval they repress what does not fit the image of goodness demanded by parents, teachers, or culture. These repressed qualities, anger, jealousy, sexuality, ambition, sink into the unconscious, forming the shadow. As adults, we continue to hide these aspects behind personas that win us social belonging. But what is hidden does not die. It waits, manifesting in projections, conflicts, or compulsions. We condemn in others what we cannot accept in ourselves, believing we fight evil when in truth we flee from our own reflection. The world becomes divided into good and bad, heroes and villains, while the individual remains split within, forever haunted by the part of themselves they have exiled. To own one's darkness requires the courage to withdraw these projections and face the inner world honestly. It means recognizing that the cruelty we despise, the greed we condemn, the envy we mock, all live somewhere within us. The shadow is not an external force, but a psychic reality, a reservoir of instincts and emotions that contain both destruction and creativity. When we acknowledge it, we begin to see that even our most shameful impulses have meaning. Anger can become the power to defend truth, lust the energy for creation, pride the confidence to act. Integration transforms the raw material of the shadow into vitality and authenticity. Repression, by contrast, leaves us hollow, brittle, and easily controlled by fear or guilt. Modern culture, obsessed with moral posturing and public image, makes shadow work even more difficult. In the age of visibility, people curate their lives to appear flawless, kind, or enlightened, while their unresolved darkness festers unseen. The social media becomes a theater of personas where the collective shadow grows in the background, expressed through outrage, envy, and polarization. The more we idealize ourselves publicly, the more violently the unconscious demands expression. Outbursts of cruelty, the scandals, and moral collapses are not anomalies but symptoms of this repression. A culture that cannot admit its own capacity for evil breeds hypocrisy. True morality arises not from denying darkness, but from being conscious of it and choosing responsibility. The process of owning the shadow is therefore a moral act of the highest order. It demands humility, self-reflection, and compassion. The one must be willing to see the smallness and pettiness that coexists with love and idealism. This confrontation is painful, for it shatters the ego's illusion of purity. Yet only through this pain can integration occur. Jung compared this process to alchemy, the transformation of lead into gold. The lead is the raw, dense material of the unconscious. The gold is consciousness born from suffering and awareness. Every admission of darkness, every acceptance of imperfection, expands the field of consciousness. The individual becomes more whole, more grounded, and more capable of genuine empathy. For how can one forgive others if one has never forgiven oneself? Owning one's darkness does not mean indulging it. To integrate the shadow is to bring awareness to it, not to act it out. Consciousness transforms instinct. When the shadow is known, its energy can be directed creatively, through art, love, or meaningful work. But when it is ignored, it erupts destructively, through violence, addiction, or despair. The difference lies in awareness. The person who has met their own darkness is less likely to project it onto others, less likely to dehumanize or condemn. They see in every act of evil a distorted cry for wholeness, and in every human flaw a mirror of their own struggle. Such a person becomes capable of true compassion, for they no longer divide the world into saints and sinners, but see all beings as fragments of the same light and shadow. To own the darkness within is to claim responsibility for one's entire being. It is to cease blaming fate, society, or others for the chaos that arises from within. It is to stand before oneself without excuse or disguise and to say, "This, too, is me." In that moment of honesty, transformation begins. The shadow loses its power to dominate because it is no longer hidden. Awareness brings freedom, and freedom brings authenticity. The individual who has faced their own darkness does not become perfect. They become whole. And in that wholeness lies the possibility of peace, both within and without, for the world is healed only when its inhabitants dare to heal themselves.